What if the U.S. conquered Canada in the War of 1812? An often glossed over part of history is that in the War of 1812, the U.S. invaded British-owned Canada, and only due to the ineptness of the American generals and to the brave defense of the Canadian militia, the U.S. was driven out, and Canada became an independent country. How would a world with Canada wiped off the map in the early 19th century be different? What would the borders be like? What would life be like? That is a question of this alternate history. In this timeline, the U.S. commanders are not as inept, and due to the lack of British forces in Canada, the Americans conquer Canada. This would lead to a U.S. control of all of Canada west of the Maritimes, which the British were able to hold on to because the Royal Navy would prevent any American attacks on Halifax and Newfoundland. Due to cultural, religious, and lingual similarities, English-speaking Canada would fit into the U.S. pretty well. But Quebec, due to cultural, lingual, and religious differences, would likely not fit in the U.S. very well, and the U.S. would likely treat the Quebecois quite harshly, similarly to New Mexico and the Hispanic population of New Mexico in our timeline. An often glossed over part of history, because Canada is part of the Commonwealth, is that in 1837 to 1838, there was a rebellion in Ontario and Quebec, and this was for a few reasons. The first of which was that in Quebec, they still had a feudal-like system, and the native Quebecois hated this. Well, also, the Canadians had no representation, and were basically being governed by British governors. The rebellion of 1837 would be slightly different in this timeline than in our timeline. This is as Ontario would not revolt, as it would be a state and thus have representation. But Quebec, not having representation, and having Anglo-colonists moving in to farm the land, thus taking land from the French Canadians, and the American government repressing the French Canadians, would mean that the Quebecois would still rebel. Britain would likely use this rebellion amongst the Canadians as an excuse to declare war on the U.S., to try to reconquer Canada, and try to stunt the U.S.'s growth as an economic superpower that would endanger Britain on the global market. As was shown in our timeline during the Crimean War, the British Army was extremely inept during this time period. While meanwhile, as shown in the Mexican-American War, the American Army was not as inept. This being coupled with the British being able to only supply and transport a small army to the Americas would likely lead to an American victory against the British in this war in the 1830s. The war would likely go something like this. The British would land a force in eastern Canada to help the Canadian rebels, and after initial success, the Americans, for the reasons that I mentioned earlier, would drive the British force out, then attacking the British base at Halifax and conquering New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. Yet again, due to the greatness of the British Royal Navy, the British would be able to hold on to Newfoundland in this timeline. As the British crushed the Canadian rebellion with a relatively small force, we can assume that the Americans, having a larger force in the Americas, could also crush the Canadian rebellion. Meanwhile, as Canada would all be free states, to create a balance between free and slave states in this timeline, the U.S. would annex more of northern Mexico, so that there could be a balance between slave and free states. The reason the Russians sold Alaska to the Americans was that they were worried in a future war the British would use their naval superiority to steal Alaska off the Russians. Looking for people to sell Alaska to, they found the Americans, and they sold Alaska to the Americans. But without the British owning Canada, there would have been no worry that the British would steal Alaska, so the Russians would have had no reason to sell Alaska, and so Alaska would remain part of Russia. That is, until the Russian Civil War, in which the U.S. would annex Alaska to prevent it from falling into communist hands. And that is how Alaska would become part of the U.S. in this timeline. In World War II, without Canada as a base in the Battle of the Atlantic, Britain would likely be starved to death by the German U-boats, and so Britain would likely fall without Canada's help in World War II, and the Nazis would win World War II. I've actually made a timeline about what if the Germans were to win World War II, and the link to it is in the description, and if you want to see it, just click on the link and it'll take you there. And the timeline is basically the same to what it would have been in this timeline if the Germans had won World War II. Meanwhile, like the Philippines and Panama, the U.S. would likely let Quebec become an independent country in the 1950s, while the rest of Canada would likely remain under U.S. control. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this timeline, please comment and subscribe. What if Altist? Thank you for watching.